Good morning, and welcome to the last breakfast on the moon. I'm your host, Joseph Bland, president of the Sacramento L5 Society, one of the oldest chapters in the National Space Society. Oh, by the way, this is Eugene Cernan on the moon saluting the flag for Apollo 17. That's a NASA picture. Credit to NASA, please. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate an era that ended almost exactly half a century ago. An era marked on one end by the Apollo 11 mission and marked on the other end by the Apollo 17 mission. After much sacrifice, humanity, in the person of Neil Armstrong, stepped on Earth's moon on July 21st, 1969 at 2:56 Coordinated Universal Time. On December the 14th, 1972, sometime after 8 Coordinated Universal Time, humanity, this time in the person of Eugene Cernan, stepped off of Earth's moon for a final time. Today, nearly 50 years later, that era, spanning 3.5 years, still stands as the penultimate example of humanity's potential for greatness. For supplying us with that example, we gathered together today to celebrate, honor, not just the final Apollo mission of Apollo 17, but all the Apollo missions and all the individuals that made that possible. It is now my great honor and privilege to introduce to you the Honorable Dr. Ami Bera, U.S. Representative-elect and senior member of the Science, Space, and Aeronautics Subcommittee of the U.S. House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Here's Dr. Bera's tape.
Hi, I'm Congressman Ami Bera from Sacramento County. I'm sorry I can't be with you this morning. I'm flying back from Washington, D.C. right now. So I really want to congratulate the L5 Society for commemorating Apollo 17's anniversary. The Apollo mission was historic. Going up to Apollo 17, the last time we had human beings walk on the moon. That's why I'm excited as a member of the Space Subcommittee in Congress that we have the Artemis program, and that I think soon we will actually have a return to the moon. We could even see a colony being built on the moon. The moon could be incredibly important on our mission to go to Mars. We know that there's lunar ice there, and we can turn that ice into fuel. So the future in space travel, the future in space exploration is incredibly exciting. So let's inspire the next generation of future Ami Beras to think big, broadly, to think about Mars, but think about beyond what's out there in our galaxy and beyond our galaxy. So thank you again for everything you do supporting space exploration, supporting our scientific missions, and be well, be safe, and let's be kind to one another.
Thank you, Dr. Bera. Next, it is my great privilege to introduce to you National Space Society President, Michelle Hanlon. Michelle received a Juris Doctor degree from Georgetown University Law Center and a Master of Laws degree in Air and Space Law from McGill University. She is the co-founder and president of For All Moonkind Incorporated, an international nonprofit which is working with the United Nations and the international community to manage the preservation of history and human heritage in outer space. Here's Michelle's tape.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Hanlon. I'm honored to be the president of the National Space Society. I'm a space lawyer and also very proud to be the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Ours is one of only 4 universities around the world that hosts an air and space law program, and the only one that is accredited by the American Bar Association. I'm also the president and co-founder of For All Moonkind, the only organization in the world focused on protecting cultural heritage, our human history, in outer space. Let me start by thanking Joe for giving me the honor of sharing a few brief thoughts with you. This week is both exultant and sobering. It has been 50 years since a human being last set foot on another celestial body. 50 years. Let that sink in. We seriously had no business being on the moon 50 years ago, and yet we did it. The Apollo program is truly the greatest technological achievement of humanity to date. How did we get there? We were driven, persistent, dogged, unwavering in our pursuit, even in the face of catastrophic and deadly failure. The moonwalkers are heroes indeed. I love listening to people like Apollo engineer Ron Creel talk about the esteem and awe with which they held the Apollo astronauts. We might have built the rovers, Ron says, but they were the ones who were up there and drove them. And there's a picture of one of the rovers from Apollo 17. Even so, the lessons of Apollo are about so much more than heroes of space exploration. They are lessons of courage, persistence, ingenuity, and hope. As we spend the next days reflecting on humanity's last crewed mission to the moon, remember that we reach for the stars not simply because they are there, but because the future of humanity, both here on Earth and in space, depends on our ability to explore and discover. Today, we truly stand as giants, not just Apollo astronauts, but of all humans everywhere through multiple cultures and generations who have dreamed of one day reaching humans. We have done an incredible job of harnessing assets in our orbit to better our life here on Earth, and this is just the beginning. When Orville and Wilbur Wright set out to make humans soar, who on Earth could have imagined that in less than a century, not only would air travel become ubiquitous, but that we would put humans on the moon? And in just over a century, deep space is in the reach of everyday humans. No one here today can sincerely imagine what the future will look like in 100 years, because none of us knows what is out there. Thank goodness we are on the way to finding out. This has been billed as the last breakfast, and certainly it is the last of our 50th celebrations for Apollo. But let me challenge you to make this the first breakfast of Artemis and of a future where humans do not have to be heroes to go to space. So here's to Apollo 17, here's to Apollo, here's to Artemis, and here's to protecting the boot prints and all that Apollo stands for. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, President Hanlon. At this time, we are deeply honored to welcome Jerry Griffin, Lead Flight Director for Apollo 17. But before we hear from him, I owe a deeply felt personal apology to Dr. Anthony Postian, who was to have conducted a third breakfast interview with Jerry. But due to a technical difficulty, for which I take personal responsibility, he was unable to connect to the breakfast in a timely fashion. Indeed, the same problem that kept Tony from attending kept out several other invited guests, and my apology extends to them as well. This failure on my part is doubly unfortunate for you, the viewers, because Tony has been a very large part of the Breakfast on the Moon series, starting with the Apollo 12 breakfast and continuing with two previous interviews Tony conducted with Jerry, helping us celebrate Apollo 14 and Apollo 15. In fact, those interviews would not have taken place if Tony hadn't actively worked to invite Jerry in the first place. And while it's impossible to make up for the error that excluded Tony from the opportunity to close out the Breakfast on the Moon series with yet a third interview of Jerry, what I have done is this. The interview will be conducted by another guest presenter, Gerald Nordley, who kindly agreed to step into the role at the last second in order for an interview to be conducted. You will hear from Gerald again towards the end of this breakfast. He has a fascinating tale to tell of his personal involvement in a little-known program that stood ready to protect the Apollo astronauts from death or serious injury in the event that, during their voyages, a major solar flare should be directed towards the Earth. Accordingly, following the upcoming interview with Jerry, I have inserted Tony's masterful Apollo 12 Breakfast on the Moon celebration presentation. Indeed, that presentation, as it turns out, is an extremely appropriate way to honor this particular breakfast, since it speaks broadly to the Apollo program as a whole, for which the Apollo 17 mission was the capstone. Gerald, I'm going to ask you to be the interviewer.
There we go, the Gerald and Jerry show.
Yeah. In the Mission Control Center, you're actually running things, right?
Yeah, I had been, I was selected to be a flight director. Had been a flight controller during Gemini, and then after the fire, I was selected to be a flight director. There were only three at the time because Chris Kraft had gotten out of that business. He was running all of flight operations, so he had a much bigger plate. So he brought in 3 new guys, and 6 of us did the entire Apollo program. It was a very, very interesting job. You know, the job of being a flight director is very much like conducting an orchestra. You don't play any of the instruments anymore, but you have to make that symphony all sound right and come together and mix the parts. So it's a fascinating job. By the way, I later became this director of the Johnson Space Center. And but I still say to this day, the best job I ever had in my life was being a flight director during Apollo and mission control. You know, it was challenging. It was a lot of fun, mainly because because it never had been done before. And I've often said now, it was a very, very interesting time. And of course, Apollo 17 was the capstone of Apollo. There's no doubt. But actually, those last 3 missions, 15, 16, and 17, that had the rover, we went to some very rugged areas of the moon and made successful landings and got them all back. But 17 also, you just got to say, it had a real scientist on board, Jack Schmidt, who Harrison, most people would call him. But he had also gone through pilot training after he came to NASA. So he was a full-up astronaut. He was flying the T-38 jets in Houston after he went through Air Force flight training. So we had that guy on the surface with PhD geology behind his name, which really, I think, kind of was the final word on why were we going? How did we get there? And in those later years, those later missions, we really focused on why we were going, and that was to explore the moon.
Yeah. You had, let's see, 3 manned space vehicles to take care of in Apollo 17. You had the command service module, and you had the lunar lander, and a dune buggy.
That's right. That's right. And actually, we had a 4th, and that was the people, because they were like in the suits, because those suits were very much like a spaceship. It was just mobile. So we had a lot of moving parts. And you know, Gerald, the thing that impressed me over the years is how well all that hardware worked. Gosh, when I think back of the technology we were working with, and I tell this to the young Artemis people in Houston now when I get a chance to brief them or talk with them, and I do quite a bit of that, that it was, you guys are going to have much better tools to do what we did. And, you know, they are very gracious. All the people in NASA are very gracious about the role that Apollo played. And they used the term that they stood on our shoulders now to get Artemis done. And, you know, I've thought about that. I think the thing probably came out of Apollo that has probably set Artemis on a good track is the fact that we did it, and we did it 50 years ago. And let me explain that just a second. We didn't know for sure we could do it. We thought we could, and we had great leadership and great contractors and all of that. But we were a bunch of young people that, you know, never had done anything like that. And so we were just going to keep trying until we figured out we couldn't do it. And I guess we were too young to realize that we couldn't do it. And I'm not just talking about mission control. I'm talking about the whole system. Once we did it, that at least takes that piece of the wonderment about going back at least it's been done. So you know it can be done. You know it can be done and have great results. So that, I think, if anything, that they're standing on the shoulders of Apollo, it's the fact that we just did it. And we landed 6 times and got everybody home and didn't leave anybody on the moon. So it's a great step. I'm sorry that it's taken 50 years to take that next step, but we're on the right track.
Yeah, you're doing this. I won't say without computers, but without very much computer assistance, and you're having to use human beings to do all sorts of things that had to be done and done right, and cross-checked and all of that. The management challenge must have been great.
No, it was, but if you think about it, it was state of the art. We didn't know there was anything better. We had 5 IBM 360 75s, Block 75. They were the cat's meow. One of them would fill up my house, and the air conditioning required was incredible. It took, some of you are old enough to remember computer cards, IBM cards, we called them, kind of as a slang, racks of, you just make sure you don't drop one of them, because if you do, you've lost the whole program. You got to do it again. So literally, you could walk in those computer room, and it was on the very first floor of the control center. There were 5 of them, and you could have hung the meat in there. It was so cold because there were vacuum tubes and all that were generating a lot of heat. Nowadays, in the cell phone that I'm talking to you on, I've got more RAM, more random access memory. I've got more storage than we had in one of those 360 75s. So it's just amazing, the tools now that these young people are going to have to go back to the moon. And it's going to be a lot easier.
Well, we certainly hope it'll be easier and safer. Let's see. Well, I am still remembering. Was there anything special that happened in Apollo 17 that I remember that big, huge rock?
Yeah, the house rock. Yeah, that huge one. Yeah. You know, 17 was actually a very clean mission. Once we got off Earth, we were delayed launching, and it seemed to go on and on. And that was the only time that a launch was delayed because of a launch pad problem. It was a sequencer situation. It was not the spacecraft or the Saturn V. It was the launch pad itself. Only time it happened. But it gave us a very nice nighttime launch that was beautiful to watch. It was like the sun coming up. I was in Houston, of course, but anyway, it was the mission was clean. That's what the term we use. We had every mission had some issues, but some were major and some were not so major. They were nagging. We just had some nagging things. One of the ones that was interesting is Eugene Cernan on the surface of the moon had a hammer in his lower leg pocket, and he went by the lunar rover and accidentally caught it on the fender and tore it off. Well, what that did is when they started moving on the surface, it was throwing dust clear over their head and down on top of them.
I remember that.
So they figured out a way finally using checklist covers and some clips to devise a fender of sorts that worked well. It kept the dust at least off the top of them. So minor stuff like that we had, but that mission was extremely clean. And you know, 17 spent more time on the moon. spent more time outside the lunar module, the EVAs. I like to call them excursions. They did 3 excursions, of them roughly 7 hours or so. And they brought back more samples than any other mission. Now, the lunar module had been enhanced on those last 3 missions. It had a long capability to stay there. But my point is I think finally at the end of the program, those last 3 missions, and particularly Apollo 17, turned out to be real exploration missions to very tough areas of the moon, which I think signals well for times to come.
Yeah, that's the exploration. It got more and more involved with the moon and less involved with the process of getting to the moon. And
that's a very good way to say it. I've called it transportation. In early days, the transportation system, we were focused on it. We wanted to get them up there and get them back and get us what some might pick up on the way. Those last 3 missions, that all changed. And let me give you an anecdote of one reason it did. Apollo 15, the commander was Dave Scott, still a very good friend. I was the lead flight director for that flight. And Dave came to me and said, why don't you come out into the field with us on our field trip and follow along with us and the scientists on how to do this? Well, I did. I went to New Mexico. I went to Arizona with them. And it was somewhat eye-opening. It really did turn my focus to exploration because I learned a lot about geology in those sessions. And so I came back to Houston and I told Gene Kranz, who is the head of the flight director office, I said, you need to go out and watch these guys and see how they do it, see how they communicate with scientists and so forth. And he did. And then another flight director went. And on 16 and 17, we had people from headquarters going even to watch these training sessions. So bottom line, we kind of got the whole group of us thought about that's why we're going there. Now, let's don't take our eye off the safety issue. We can't. We've got to get them there and back. But let's focus on the exploration and just keep that safety issue in mind. And it can be done. That was the change. And so if Artemis is going to have to go through the same process. Early on, they're going to be worried to death about the getting there and back. And they're going to grab what science they can. Later on, I think it will mature just like it did with us. And they will really focus on exploring not only some very difficult areas, but the South Pole, which has never even been a problem. We didn't have the performance to go to the South Pole. They're going there on the first mission. And that's going to be extremely interesting.
Now, NASA has actually contracted out the last step from lunar orbit down to the surface of the moon. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's going to go well, or do you think do you have a little bit of a reservation about that?
You know, Gerald, I think the commercial play in this is all proper at all levels. In fact, when I was director of the Johnson Space Center, I tried to get the commercial people to put some of their own money up. They never would do it. They said stockholders wouldn't like it. So when it finally happened, and SpaceX and the Falcon and the Dragon, and then later on Bezos came in with his suborbital Blue Origin, but he's building a big rocket that's going to launch from the Cape as well. Now, how does that play into the lander? There's no doubt that the commercial sector can build it. I would have liked to have seen them. Their original plan was to go with 2 contractors, so they would have a backup. They would have a prime person and a backup vehicle. They didn't have the money to do that, so they went with just one. Now they're going back. They've just let out the request for proposal for a second lander. And I think so far there is one team that is kind of stands out. It involves Blue Origin, but it also involves Lockheed and Grumman. And so there is we will have two, I think, eventually, two landers. But right now we've only got one, and it's having some trouble. It's being built here in Texas, down at Boca Chica, which is right down on the tippy point of Texas. And they're going to launch test flights out over, and eventually some other flights out over the Gulf. But that lander is having some issues, and they've just had problems with it. And hopefully they're about past those. But that's going to be the long pole in the tent for the first landing. Is going to get that is getting that lander ready in time. And that's a SpaceX lander. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the concept. They've just run into some issues here that I think they got to straighten out.
Well, they're going to have to. It's not going to be their first Starship. They're going to put the landing engines way up on top of that tower and do a tractor thing shooting out of the sides of the rocket. I guess to avoid stirring up the moon dust. But how do you think that's going to work?
Well, I don't. To tell you the truth, I haven't looked at all that detail yet. I've seen some of the fantastic videos of the explosions on the pad trying to just test fly it. And but it's a very long, tall, skinny lander, and the dynamics of that kind of bother me. There you go, there it is. Yeah. And it looks. There was an old movie in the 50s called Destination Moon. And I think it was 1950, and that's something like the rocket looked like. I like a two-stage rocket. That's also a one-stage. I like what we had in Apollo with a descent stage that once it landed, it was a launch platform. The ascent stage then took us off of the moon, and it was completely separate, different system. I actually, maybe it's because of my background, but I kind of like that two-stage version rather than that single stage.
Well, the Destination Moon was a nuclear rocket.
Yeah, that's right.
It got a little more Delta V there.
Yeah, and it involved the Department of Defense. Oh my goodness.
Well, yeah, actually, to put a little drama into the thing, they had to take off without government approval.
That's right. That's right. You got it. I've got that on DVD. Still got it.
It was one of the really good movies, and still stands as the sociology was a little bit clunky, but they got the zero G and everything in space travel just about right. Back in the 1949, 52 or whatever that was, and Hollywood hasn't caught up except maybe for 2001 with that sort of realism yet.
Yeah, boy, you're right on. I can tell you know that movie, and it's interesting that long ago, in the 1950s, early 50s, I think it was 50 or 52, something like that, when the foresight that some people had that it could be done, and so forth. It was a very crude film, but I mean, in terms of high def and all that, but it was a fun film, and even had some effect on me being interested in space. I don't know. I remember being very interested in the movie. I'm gonna have to leave. Let me just say I really enjoyed being with you. I think reminiscing about Apollo and Apollo 17 and maybe thinking on to the future, I think is very timely. I love talking about it. And I think you guys do a wonderful job of keeping it in the forefront. I'm sorry, Tony didn't make it with us today. I've worked with Tony a lot over the last several years, and he's one of your best.
Because he was obviously a big part of the interviews that we've done in the past. We're all applauding in our silent cubicles right now for what you just did. Bye-bye,
Okay.
Jerry.
Bye.
Our next presenter is Dr. Anthony Postian, who, as I've said, has been an absolutely essential part of this whole series, and to whom I personally am deeply indebted. Tony is the current NSS Vice President of Marketing. He has authored several books, including 250,000 Steps, winner of several literary awards, and is a regular contributor to NSS's Ad Astra magazine. He has created a technology-focused college campus that has received national media attention for its groundbreaking initiatives. Here's Tony's 2020 tape.
I come at this with a little bit different perspective, and this is part of the perspective I'm going to try to bring into ISDC 2020 next year as well, because I'm the chair of ISDC next year. And that is, and also when I write about Apollo, I've written a number of articles at Astra about Apollo from a leadership management perspective. Not as much about the details of the missions as much as what we should, gain and garner from each mission and apply towards today. I've had the opportunity and the great fortune, I should say, of having the ability to get to know a lot of these Apollo astronauts very well, and not just the astronauts, but a lot of the flight controllers and the flight directors, etc. I mean, so much so where I've stayed at a lot of their houses before, so I've got a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, especially with the two L's, L. Bean and Al Warden. And Al Bean to me kind of gave a different perspective of what going to the moon was like. And some of the things he said to me have always stuck with me. And you have to understand that by trade, right now I'm an educator. I was a former Air Force fighter pilot back in the day, but now I'm an educator. I'm a college provost in Iowa. And I work with young minds every day, trying to inspire them into STEM careers. But I'm also an educational psychologist, and that's what my background is. So I always try to look at the psychological perspective of all kinds of problem solving and how they deal with things. But some of the things that Al Bean said to me, just always kind of stuck with me, because they have to do with a lot of perspective issues when it comes to leaving the Earth and going to another heavenly body outside Earth. One of the things that Al said, when he and I were chatting over coffee one morning, he said that when I got to the moon, and when I landed on the moon and I got out and I was walking around, I was looking back at Earth, he goes, we have no idea how good we really have it on the Earth. I mean, we spend so much time bickering and arguing and over petty things, and then just not realizing how good we really have it in the perspective of the universe. And then he said that when I got back to Earth, I never once ever complained about the weather ever again. Now, he lived in Houston, so I mean Houston gets their weather, believe me. And he goes, I never complained about the weather ever again, because I was just happy to have it. And that's a perspective that only an Apollo astronaut could have, because we're so used to having weather and bad weather and good weather and all the weather in between, that we often complain about the weather, we whine about it because we're spoiled. We don't really understand, appreciate the planet we live on. And it takes a unique perspective getting outside of the planet in order to look at the planet to understand what we have. He also said something else that kind of stuck with me to this day, and this is what I do a lot of writing about, because these are the kind of lessons we need to take to heart. And that is, he realized when he first got to NASA, I mean, he was a test pilot for the Navy. When he first got to NASA, he thought he was going to come in and just be surrounded by super smart people that all knew what they were doing, and it was going to be just, hey, I'm going to jump into this thing, I'm going to fly it. And then he goes, I remember I went to the first big meeting, we sat down, and I realized in about 10 minutes, we were in trouble. Nobody had a clue. And he's sitting there, and we're just like, nobody knows what they're doing here. And it was the process of going from that to watching all of what he called the doers, the people who were doing all of the work, the people who were doing all the math, all the engineering, all the science to make it happen, that was the most important, the most amazing thing to him, far more than actually going to the moon. In fact, he often said that the greatest thing NASA ever did was creating the ability to contingency think, to think about all the problems that could happen, that hopefully won't happen, but they could, and to go through and develop a procedure for every one of those possibilities. And the ability that NASA had to think through that, to elaborate in the abstract, so to speak, mentally, and do all those things, that was NASA's greatest accomplishment of all, because they were able to predetermine problems long in advance that many times saved missions without even realizing it as they were creating the solutions to the problems. So he spends a lot of time focusing on all the people that usually the people that nobody ever gives any credit to or doesn't get much credit to, because they're kind of behind the scenes. They were doing all their little job, their task, their one purpose. They were doing all the things that they were supposed to do as part of the job, but they weren't on the forefront. They weren't getting all the press, and he puts a lot of accolades into those people, and he always has, as long as I've known him. He's a class guy, and he always thought they were far more important than what he did. So, and of course, I discussed that with a lot of the Apollo astronauts. They all say the same thing, but in different ways. But Al did it with certain grace. Al did it with certain humbleness that I haven't heard from the others. And I mean, he even calls himself. It's been mentioned before, but he's even often calls himself, I'm an artist that happened to be an astronaut, because his art was his real passion, and having gone to space was great and cool and everything for him, but his real passion was art. And it just shows how, despite the great thing he did, he's still a very humble guy about it, and he just that says a lot about him as a person as well as an astronaut. The problem that I see today, and the reason why we need to keep talking about Apollo, is, unfortunately, as an educator, and I'm seeing a very sad shift happening in education today. Where, well, here I'll tell you, there's a recent study that was done that shows that at the time of the Apollo launches, there were about 5% of the people out there who did not believe we actually went to the moon while it was happening. About 5%. There are always the conspiracy theorists out there. Unfortunately, that has risen to a most recent number showing about almost 30 to 35% now believe that, which is unheard of to me, unbelievable to me, but about a third. And it's mostly in young people. And that's because young people weren't around. Young people just have no connection to it whatsoever. These are the same people that utilize technology today, that often, but much of which came out of the Apollo program, but they utilize the technology today. Don't give it a thought of where it came from. They just assume it was always there. And they believe this conspiracy theorist concept. They saw some video on YouTube or whatever. And I think it is our task, our mandate as people who are a little bit older, to constantly wave this flag and talk about the greatness that was. Someone earlier mentioned the greatest generation, the fought World War II. That's something else that's fading away here pretty fast too. The perspective and the understanding of what it took to win the World War. And as we get further and further away from something, in history, it fades. And this is something that can't fade, especially if we're trying to inspire a generation. Gene Cernan once told me that, I asked him point blank, I said, Gene, what is the most important, the one thing about your career you're the most proud of? And I honestly thought he'd say, well, walking on the moon has to be towards the top. No, Gene's first thing out of his mouth, and he did not hesitate, was, I am most proud of the fact that I was part of something that inspired an entire generation to go into science, technology, engineering, and math. An entire generation to do that, which he did. That was my generation. And that is not there anymore. There is nothing out there today that's inspiring our entire generations of kids anymore to do something like this. And that's what's missing. And that's why we have to keep doing this and keep talking about Apollo. And I know that there are some people on NSS who think, oh, let's talk future. Let's not get into the past so much. Apollo's great. It's wonderful. It happened. Let's talk about all the cool stuff in the future. And I'm not trying to take anything away whatsoever from what Elon and Jeff and all the other ones are doing out there. at SpaceX and Blue Origin. But I will tell you that what they're doing, despite how cool it is, it still doesn't measure up anywhere close to what we did with Apollo in the 60s at all. And I can give 1,000 reasons why that is true. So we got to make sure we keep talking about it and we keep telling the stories to young people and show them. And this last year was a good year because it was the 50th anniversary. My fear is that's going to fade. Apollo 12 has happened and launched last week, and we're celebrating that right now. But you're not hearing much about it in the press right now, or anything for that matter, like you did Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. We might hear a little bit about because of the movie. Apollo 14 and 15 and 16 won't have much anything probably attached to those either. We might hear about Apollo 17 a little bit just because it's the last time. But we got to keep talking about it. We got to keep sharing these stories, and we got to keep learning from the past in order to make the future happen. Because the future will only happen if we can learn from the past. So that's my primary take on this. I tend to come at it from a more psychological perspective. I will tell you that one of the things we're going to do at ISTC is we're going to look at how science, I'm going to run a track called Science Fiction to Fact, talk about what we can learn from science fiction to help us make the future happen, and also how science fiction inspired people to make things happen. A whole panel of engineers will be on that panel as well. But if you think about it, Apollo was science fiction the decades prior to it happening. So it's important we keep the imagination flowing. It's important we keep people engaged.
Thank you, Tony, for sharing that with us. And thank you for contributing to 4 fantastic breakfasts. In a bit, we'll be hearing a series of mini presentations from several folks who have done fantastic presentations in previous Breakfast on the Moon celebrations. And take my word for it, these little vignettes are well worth waiting for. But first, I've asked some of the silent supporters of the Breakfast on the Moon series over the years to attend live and take a quick virtual bow, as it were. First, Roger Arnold. Roger is a former physicist, aerospace engineer, and systems architect. He has worked at IBM, Boeing Aerospace, AT&T, and a number of electronics companies and startups in San Diego and Silicon Valley. Now retired, he pursues independent research and writing. Roger, flip your mic on and introduce yourself.
Hello. It's been interesting just to listen to what's gone on so far. It's a very good reminder of some very interesting times, and I'm looking forward to a repeat of the whole Apollo experience with Artemis. Hopefully it goes as well.
Thank you very much, Roger. Okay, next, Chris Cernan, who has served as National Space Society Chapters Assembly Correspondent Secretary and then Executive Secretary. And Chris is a 25-year member of the National Space Society's Los Angeles chapter, OASIS, and has recently joined the Sacramento L5 Society, where we hope to keep her for at least another 25 years. Chris?
Hi, thank you very much for the introduction. I've attended all of the Breakfasts on the Moon, and I'm just very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Next, Terry Dutray. Terry lives in Colorado and has been an NSS member since 2006. She became an NSS Space Ambassador in 2010. She's assisted the Enterprise in Space project and presently serves on the Chapters Assembly Resources Committee. Terry?
Hi. I think the most important thing from all of this is that we just continue on. My dad got me involved with the space movement when I was 4 years old. And so that was in 1969. And in 1972, at the end of the Apollo programs, I was sad. And he said, you know what? It's not the end, it's just the beginning. And so that was just so enlightening that he said that and kept me involved with it. One of the things I think that is so important with this is the show and tell aspect of all of this, bringing the generations forward. So one of my artifacts from when I was 4 years old, and I held up some of those photos a few minutes ago, is this picture. And this is from 1969, and I've had this publication since then. So thanks for everything you've done, and let's keep going.
Thanks, Terry. Our next will be Jeffrey Liss, a longtime member of NSS and who's served in many and varied roles. And I'll let you talk about yourself a little.
I'm a retired transactional attorney. I'm a former senior vice president of NSS and a longtime director. I also write science fiction, and I wrote a story about my reaction to Apollo 17 and where it led. I'd like to read just a couple of short paragraphs, which I think may be of interest. Quick, it's going now. They scrambled to the window of the truck. A few seconds later, a blast of light transformed the midnight into, it wasn't like daytime, but was more awesome, like Ben imagined in a church it would be when the angels came. And then as that slim rocket rose slowly on a column of flame, the red and yellow radiance was reinforced by the sound of thunder that rolled through the truck and over the silent throngs. What power, Ben thought, to make such a noise so loud, so far away. Who could even imagine how to do it? Behind him, his father grasped his shoulders, whispering, "Never forget. Never forget." "Oh, Dad," Ben whispered, "that was beautiful." He hesitated, curiosity mingling with excitement, then asked, "Why was it the last?" And that story was published in Artemis Science Fiction magazine. That was my reaction when Apollo 17 went, why was it the end?
Much appreciated. Next, Christine Noby. Christine is a public school educator and a gifted education specialist. A child of the Apollo era, she has spent a lifetime thinking about and living and working on the moon. She volunteers as a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador. Christine?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I am the youngest of 4 children. So before I even went to school, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. I just loved school. And at 10 years old, I watched the landing, Apollo 11 landing on the moon. And it looked like to me that the future might hold a space where I would be actually a teacher living and working on the moon. Now, that has not happened. So instead, I dedicated my time teaching, focusing on space exploration. And a good part of the time that I was teaching full-time, all those decades, it was on how to live and work on the moon. Now that I'm not teaching full-time anymore, I am doing a lot of outreach, for National Space Society, the St. Louis Space Frontier, and then also for the Solar System Ambassador Program at JPL. And I always include, as much as I can, that Apollo 17 video where the astronauts are bounding across the moon and they're singing "Walking on the Moon One Day." And that little video clip is so silly and joyful, and it kind of looks like space travel is easy and engaging. So it gives the kids the idea that space exploration is joyful and interesting. And it has inspired a lot of kids to be interested in living and working in space. As a wrap up, I just want to say I am so darn excited about the Artemis program. With this Artemis 1 mission looking very successful, flash down is tomorrow morning. It looks like, we really might be living and working on the moon in my lifetime.
Thank you so much. And by the way, thank you for fielding all of the questions on the Q&A. Next is Dennis Pearson. Dennis is another longtime member of the National Space Society, and he served in many capacities, including chair of the National Space Society Chapters Assembly. Dennis?
I was elected chair of the Chapter Assembly in 2010 at Chicago for the class conducted by the University of Texas, in which I became eligible to display moon rocks. And I did display a moon rock in 2004 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. This is an example of the moon rock replica that I was able to obtain as souvenir. The company that produces this took real moon rocks, made casts for them, and tried to duplicate the markings using basically materials similar to what they found. Should I sell this or give it away, I would have to tell this company and NASA whom I gave it to, even though this is not a real rock.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Joe and Carol Redfield. Joe is a consultant and business owner who works in the energy sector. He has been treasurer of the National Space Society since the 1991 International Space Development Conference in San Antonio, Texas. Carol is chair and professor of computer science at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. She was a member of both the NSI and the L5 Society when they merged to make the NSS. NSI stands for National Space Institute, by the way. And she helped form the San Antonio Space Society shortly after those two organizations merged. Carol?
Thanks. Hey.
Hello.
I was on the board briefly. Joe's been on and off the board of NSS for a while.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that what keeps me started me and keeps me involved in National Space Society, besides great people that we have, is that I am a proponent of the more people who get access to a global view, the more we will be able to think from a global viewpoint, a bigger view, which always positively affects and impacts more people. And then I'm going to show a picture about our kids. Our son Neil is named after Neil Armstrong, and Crystal is Crystal because it's just an awesome name. And you can make really cool crystals in space. Neil's a 29-year-old actor in New York City, and Crystal's a junior at St. Mary's University studying communication studies. So the picture I want to show is of Neil and Buzz. It's titled Neil and Buzz: The Next Generation because the Star Trek The Next Generation was out at the same time. And that's when I was on the board, and Neil was at the board meetings because I was breastfeeding, so he had to be there. What do you want to say?
I didn't say anything.
All right. So thank you for letting us be part of this.
Yep. Thank you, both of you, Joe and Carol. And next, Phyllis Redhair. Phyllis has served as president of the Phoenix chapter of the National Space Society. Phyllis? And I'm not sure what you're up to these days, so fill us in, Phyllis.
Yeah, just working, I guess I could say I'm a citizen scientist. Mostly I do samples and then I test components. And then I just do other various things to help further the cause. But when I first started, I was the executive secretary for Chapters Assembly. And then we were getting all these breakfasts on the moon together, and that was so much fun. And that really influenced direction for my chapter on what kind of things we could do for the Apollo 50th anniversary from the beginning. And it's been a really awesome time to get to speak to lots of people about Apollo missions. And I appreciate you, Joseph. Thank you for letting me come along with the ride.
Thank you, Phyllis. Next, Bennett Rutledge. Bennett has served in several capacities with the National Space Society, and lately has served and continues to serve as chair of the National Space Society's Chapters Assembly. Bennett?
I first became seriously active, something more than an armchair supporter, the day that the Skylab fell back to Earth. And I realized that I'm marooned on this planet. And so I've been on a lot of things. Currently, I'm the chair of the National Space Society Chapters Assembly. And I'm looking forward to the day when enough of humankind's 8 billion have moved out into the galaxy, and we can turn this entire planet into a wilderness and historical park. And toward that end, I'd like to give a shout out to Dr. Mae Jemison, who is doing a lot of the groundwork for interstellar travel. Away we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just trying to work something out to where we can get Tony Postian back in to join as live. It has to do with his email that's set up for Zoom, not the email that he actually wants or can use Zoom with. So little mess up there. I apologize to Tony, and these things happen. Okay, we're moving on, and I'd like to bring up Dave Stewart, president of the Seattle chapter of the National Space Society, and he served in several capacities within the National Space Society, including vice president of chapters. He presently chairs the NSS Chapters Committee. Here is Dave's tape. Thanks, Dave. Next, Dennis Whipple. Dennis has been a space enthusiast since the early days of black and white TV. He credits his science teacher, Mr. Ryder, for keeping the dream alive. Thanks, Dave. Next, Dennis Whipple. Dennis has been a space enthusiast since the early days of black and white TV. He credits his science teacher, Mr. Ryder, for keeping the dream alive during those historical Apollo missions. After a college degree in electrical engineering, Dennis went on to fly for the Air Force for 7 years and does event video production for the National Space Society.
I served both, with the local OASIS chapter and was an NSS board member, at least for one term, and just honored to be a part of this group here, and really, really exciting to see things develop and getting back to the moon.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
You bet.
And now we turn to the supporters of the Breakfast of the Moon series who have done fantastic presentations in previous breakfasts, and who will deliver a series of mini presentations on the subject of Apollo 17 and the Apollo program in general. And Avinash is not here also, I noticed.
Avinash is here.
Is he?
Yeah.
First, a little introduction. Avinash Sharode lives and works in India. From its early days, Avinash was involved with the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO. After retiring, he founded the NSS Nashik India chapter and is their president. Avi also helped to develop the concept of a breakfast on the moon, since creating a live link with the Nashik India chapter required a very early morning start here in California. Hence, the term breakfast on the moon.
A little about me, that I am a space ambassador. Then I am president of Nashik India chapter of NSS, and I was formerly a member of board of directors from Region 1. And of course, I'm a civil engineer plus working in more than 9 different branches of engineering. One of them is space technology. And it was really a great dream for me to get into space technology. Before that, till my 3rd year engineering, I have been always associated with spirituality and that one. And I was about to leave all this world and go to Himalayas for my tranquility and all other things. But the turning point of my life came when Neil Armstrong put his foot on the surface of the moon on 20th July 69. And that really changed my life. That I decided that instead of going to Himalayas for discovery of universe, I would do that, or rather I should do the discovery by space technology. And I worked very hard to achieve my goal. Then I joined my Indian Space Research Organization. I worked there, and then again destiny played mischief, and I had to come back to my home place. But after my retirement from professional career, since last almost 7 to 8 years, I am fully involved in my alma mater of space technology. And we started our chapter in Nashik of NSS. I'm the president. Then I attended ISDC in 18 as well as 19. And of course, rather everyone knows that felicitation of NSS people and Buzz Aldrin in Los Angeles. That was a great thing for me. That was the biggest thing in my life, that I could see a person who transformed my life 50 years ago, rather 53 years ago now, and I could see him personally and felicitate him personally. Then, of course, we are working very hard for awareness of space technology, particularly for tribal and rural students. because everyone, even the general public, thinks that, oh, it's a very tough science. It's only the handful of people are working in this and that. But we make sure that everyone has got a scope to work in space technology. And I make presentations to students and general public and everywhere. You would laugh at me, even at the funeral site. I talk to people and they ask me about all this. And anyway, I'm really happy, and I'm associated with Indian Space Research Organization agency also. And we have opened up the field in space technology, rocket science, all these things, but for general public, and the first orbital mission by a private player in India was done hardly 2 weeks ago and all that. And we have very ambitious programs in India to work in space technology. Thank you, Joe, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
I'll tell you what, I'm so delighted that you could be here live, because the whole reason this is called Breakfast on the Moon is because as we speak at almost 8:30, it's nighttime, not daytime.
9 o'clock. 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. It is 9 o'clock in India right now. And so we are literally talking halfway around the world. And I'm so delighted that you could join us and kind of make the point of what these breakfasts are all about. Thank you very much, Avi, for joining us. Mistake or not.
Thank you.
Next is Lawrence Kuznets. One of Lawrence's early projects was working at NASA on spacesuit design. His design, called 41 Node Man, led directly to the spacesuits worn on the lunar surface. Lawrence was in mission control for all the Apollo moon landings. Here's Lawrence's tape.
Okay, all right. So Joe, you've asked me how I got involved with all this stuff from Apollo 11 through 17. And it started off with a little computer model that I wrote called 41 Node Man at the Johnson Space Center. Then it was a Manned Spacecraft Center. And it was a math model of the human body and a math model of the spacesuit surrounding it and a math model of the environment. And that environment could be anything from the moon to Mars to deep space to whatever it was. But the main point was the model had the ability to predict astronaut safety and consumables use. So anyway, that landed me a seat at Mission Control, Mission Operations Control Room in the life support room that was adjacent to it. So my job was to actually record the data coming from the spacesuit and then translate all of that into metabolic rate and consumables usage and time left on the surface and heat load and how hard they were working on each task. So that got me in the door for all the Apollo missions. That was 1969 to 1972, that whole Apollo era. And following that, I went off to Berkeley and did a PhD thesis using the same model, 41 Node Man, which, by the way, is still being used today. It's just remarkable. Sometimes simple is better. As life has it, changes take place, and all of a sudden, back in 2001, 2002, I needed a job again, and I ended up back in Houston after not having been at NASA for some 20-somewhat years. And I got involved with, again, life support, and for a while, I was the experiment manager on the space shuttle for human life science experiments. And then my position, I was in a building then known as Building 37, which had a history. And the history, actually, it was way in the past, it was called the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. And it's where all the Apollo samples came back and where the astronauts were put in quarantine. And decided one day, everybody should know about this and maybe there should be a commemoration. Wrote a bunch of letters and talked to a bunch of people, and I knew none of this would take place. I didn't have the clout up high enough to actually organize such a commemoration on my own. So the quickest way to make it happen was to invite Neil Armstrong. And then I knew it would happen. And again, as luck would have it, I knew Neil. I asked Neil if he wouldn't mind coming to commemorate the building that he was in quarantine in for 2 weeks. And he said, sure. So once Neil came in, all the other straws fell into place, and we had this commemoration. So on the anointed day, Neil shows up, and a couple of other people had shown up who were invited. Buzz Aldrin, through an oversight of mine, or maybe went to the email address, had not been invited, but he showed up. Buzz tends to do that sometimes. Buzz is fantastic. And so there's Neil and Buzz, and there's the flight doctors, there's Chuck Berry, and there's Bill Carpentier, some of the people who were in quarantine, people I hadn't seen in a bunch of years. And one other guy was invited, and that guy was Harrison Jack Schmidt from Apollo 17 control. So I knew Jack pretty well. So all of us had this ceremony together. Here we are 50 years later, going back to the same place, and I look at the road ahead. The next morning, hey, guess what? Your program's gone. Man, that can happen in a heartbeat. So I tend to look back on those days in that era very fondly and sadly, as a lot of folks who are in my position did, and be very grateful that you were part of it. And that's my take on all this, for better or worse.
Thanks, Lawrence. Okay, next is Ron Jones. Ron Jones is nearing the end of a 50-year aerospace and defense industry career that started at the age of 17 when he was working at the NASA Ames Lunar Impact Lab, which was supporting Apollo 17. Most in our community know Ron worked for Dr. Buzz Aldrin for many years as the head of Buzz's Share Space organization. And through Buzz, Ron had the great honor of meeting most of the Apollo and Gemini astronauts. Ron is currently on the board for the St. Louis Space Frontier and recently served on the National Space Society board as Region 4 Director. Ron?
Hi, so what I was saying was I have a lot of memories about the Apollo program and Apollo 17. You know, last December, I guess I gave a talk to this group about what I did at Ames Research Center. And at the time, heck, I was 17 years old working at a major NASA facility in this Lunar Impact Lab as an intern. And as a result of that year's work, during that year, the principal investigators I worked for won the highest award in NASA for determining the thickness of the lunar regolith by lab experimentation and comparing our results to what we were seeing, small impact craters on the moon. And the unique thing was Apollo 17, the last Apollo mission, was the only mission that we actually knew the thickness of the lunar soil before we landed. All the other missions were kind of hit and miss, but through our research, and I was the photographer. I used to work all the high-speed cameras. We determined that the thickness around the 17 landing site was like 4 meters thick. And I think looking back, most all of the landing sites are between 4 and I think 12 meters. And there was one that was a little bit less than 4, but anyway, and I never go anywhere without my little piece of the moon. I have actually a lunar meteorite that's never far. Looks just like what they brought back from the Apollo missions. Anyway, so when I was, before Apollo 17, I was, when I was 16 years old, when Buzz Aldrin and Armstrong landed on the moon. So I never dreamed, of course, when that happened, that I actually end up, working for and meeting most of these astronauts. I'm working for Buzz, and I worked for Al Worden for a while when I was at Ames, which is another story. During the flight of Apollo 17, this was a couple of years after I worked on the project. It was the last shuttle flight. I was Saturn flight, and I was 19 years old. And I figured, well, hell, if I don't get my butt back to Cape Kennedy and see this, I'll never see us, have another chance to see it. So I went out to Cape Kennedy with my friend Terry Turman, who I know some of you you're in the Bay Area, you may know the Termans from Stanford. That was a very big name back in the day. You know, his father worked with like Marconi, you know, wrote the standard text for electrical engineering. And Terry was an astrophysicist, or was a physicist working on his PhD at the time. And my girlfriend at the time was Elizabeth Oppenheimer. And yeah, she was actually related to J. Robert Oppenheimer. Her father, I forget the exact relationship, but her father was a research scientist at Lockheed there in the Bay Area working on spy satellites. So it's kind of a really incredible time. And then, you know, after that, many years after that, I ended up, you know, working for Buzz Aldrin. So, you know, that's a long story, which will take up longer than my 4 minutes. But back in the late 90s, I guess, we formed a share space organization in Washington, D.C. And I was the executive director of that for Buzz for, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years before events overtook us. And I moved on here to St. Louis. But through, you know, when you get to spend time with a guy like Buzz Aldrin in Washington, D.C., what was really amazing was I mean, I met so many incredible people, not only astronauts, but just some of the world's most amazing people. And being there in Washington, you know, our prime focus was to try to educate Congress and people in NASA and the big aerospace corporations about what we should be thinking about as a follow-on to the space shuttle. And if you guys will recall, Buzz had a concept for a reusable rocket called Star Booster. And, you know, we went around trying to convince NASA, this is like in the late 90s, early 2000s, why reusability was so important. There's no reason why we should be throwing away our rockets. Of course, back then, they didn't see it. Aerospace companies wanted no part of it because it cut down their revenues significantly. So it didn't happen. Waited till a guy like Elon Musk came along and proved everything that Buzz was talking about right. But yeah, one other memory from relating directly to Apollo 17. Back in the late 90s, we sponsored a congressional hearing. We'd spent a lot of time on the Hill. At the time, the Speaker of the House was Denny Hastert. His chief of staff was a guy named Bobby Charles, or chief counsel. Bobby, we and Barb and Bobby spent a lot of time together because Bobby said, I need to know about space. And we spent about 3 days in a hotel room just trying to give him the big picture on the space program, why this is important to us. And we ended up choreographing a congressional hearing. Actually, not on the Hill. It was the first and I think only congressional hearing that we've ever had in the Air and Space Museum. And one of the guys we had come and talk was Eugene Cernan. So Gene spent a couple of days with us, and he talked a lot about getting bold again in space. You know, we kind of lost our boldness by the year 2000. And of course, those of us that have been doing this stuff since we were kids, like Dennis Whipple and I remember Dennis and I went back to like the early, Dennis, we were teenagers out in LA forming Oasis and the groups in Northern California. But yeah, we haven't let the spark or the fire die out. So I guess that's a good thing. Anyway, I could probably go on for quite a while, but I think I was only supposed to have about 4 minutes here. So
thank you very, very much. Appreciate that, Ron. You have a lot to say. By the way, we did have a kind of non-50th anniversary introductory breakfast, which is when Ron Jones regaled us with many tales. And you'll find that in the SACO 5 YouTube site, basically a pre-Apollo 17. It was a year before the final landing celebration breakfast. Next, Steven Ackerley. Steven is a retired aerospace engineer from Pratt & Whitney with 40 years experience in engineering, manufacturing, project management, and program management. He's currently serving as director of the NSS Space Ambassadors Program.
When the Apollo program first started, I was in high school. So where was I for the Apollo 17 moonwalk? Well, I had just started my career at Pratt & Whitney. I had been out of college for a little over 2 years, very green, very inexperienced, very excited to be pursuing my aerospace and space dream, as it was. And emphasis on dreams and ideas. That was a big deal for me. And I had a lot of enthusiasm for the space program. And like many of you, I found that I was a little disappointed that some of the dreams didn't come true as quickly as I'd hoped. Since the Apollo program, we have successfully had more than 20 satellites have looked at the moon and given us a lot of information about the moon. It's interesting that there were hundreds of skylights that have been discovered, and a skylight is basically an opening into an underground lava tube, and the exposure of those lava tubes has been a near and dear subject for me. But we've also discovered volatiles in cold traps at the lunar poles. And so the future vision for the moon, in my opinion, and this is at this point becomes my opinion to a large extent, there will be surface operations for mining and processing of resources and other lunar operations, but there will also be a large amount of subsurface operations that offer potential advantages for a protected environment, eventually shirt sleeve environments, and opportunity for large biospheres. So next slide, Joe. One of the things that I was really excited about is the NASA Moon to Mars initiative and the objectives report that came out. It's interesting to note that although it's called Moon to Mars, the emphasis is clearly on getting lunar proving ground for our hardware and for our astronauts. And I think this is critically important because we need to prove both our astronauts and our hardware on the lunar surface in the lunar environment before we try to set it up on Mars. And there are 5 of these activities that I consider to be very important, not the least of which is human and biological sciences, because we need to be able to live without having to pull everything off of the Earth. So we need to use in situ resources, and we need to be able to take the human environment with us and create a short sleeve environment. So that having been said, my next slides are, and Joe, go ahead into the next slide, is focused on the potential future for the moon. And it's my belief that there will not be just one moon base, but there will be several moon bases. And we won't debate that at the present time, but this particular set of images is based on actually photographic collages of what could be done on the moon surface in the lava tubes. And this depicts a short sleeve environment with trees. And the point is you can come visit Moon Base 7 and walk our tree-lined promenade. So that's that particular idea. And I hope that at some point in the future, we will do that. And the next slide depicts a short sleeve environment and open air cafes. And this would be a draw on for anybody living on the lunar surface in tin cans. You would be anxious to get into a short sleeve environment and date your favorite person in one of these open air cafes. So, and that is the end of my talk, focusing on the future. And I think NASA's initiative and objectives are right on target, and we need to make sure that we prove ourselves on the moon before we try to go further. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Okay, Mr. Carson is going to join us now. C.D. Carson. Mr. Carson isn't old enough to remember the Apollo missions, but he is a relentless advocate for the human future in space and a firm believer in O'Neill's vision. He's also the primary subject of the 2012 documentary Lunar Sea.
Thank you, Joe. Contemplating the challenge that Joe set before us, that he invited as panelists for this, sort of to sum up the achievements of Project Apollo and somehow draw out the meaning of it, it occurred to me that it must mean something very different for me, you know, sort of a latecomer to this, than for those who lived through it. You know, the truth is, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon on my mother's 11th birthday. So to some people, I'm sure that Apollo and its achievements seem like the pyramids, right? The product of a belief system and a mindset which simply doesn't exist in the modern day world, something which is magnificent but not really relevant. And then other people obviously see them as the outcome of a geopolitical confrontation, maybe a reflection of that confrontation, and that's a situation, a historical situation, which is not going to arise again. For me, Apollo and its achievements are a foundation and one upon which we must build. And I think some of the people who've spoken before have really brought that out, that the fact that we have done these things in the past is the single biggest thing that can give us confidence for what we must do in the future. You know, as I told Joe, perhaps the first memory I have that I can put a date to is the TV coverage of the destruction of the Shuttle Challenger. And of course, 18 years later, the Shuttle Columbia broke up in the sky over my house. And, you know, I was driving on the road and the freeway signs were flashing, "Watch out for falling space shuttle debris." My father said he never thought he'd live to see the day when people would die because they were flying around in a worn out spaceship. And despite that, right, despite that being the frame of reference that I have, sort of 50 years in the wilderness, as it were, since the last time a human being walked on the surface of another celestial body, I am a firm believer in the movement of humanity into space. And the great lesson that I take away is that it must be a social movement. Now, I think Bennett Rutledge said it very rightly. We must not let ourselves be marooned on this planet, and I would add, or any other. And I genuinely believe that the NSS and the NSS chapters must see themselves in this light of a social movement. And that was something that I really tried to press during the term I served as a Region 3 director on the NSS board. But what does it mean to be a social movement? Well, the key thing to take away is that politicians and businessmen only very rarely and for brief periods of time will lead in the directions we want to go. That we may get flags and footprints out of the deal, but not for very long or at any really close intervals. If we are a social movement, then we can carry them with us. And that was, in a sense, why Apollo faltered, was the lack of that social movement to keep it going, to keep pressing, to say, no, you keep procuring those Saturn V's. You do the extended surface missions. You make Apollo applications more than just the Skylab mission, the basically precursor mission. STS can't be just shuttle. It has to be station. It has to be the OTV, those other components, right, that made up the space transportation system, and that we never really got during the lifetime of the shuttle. And of course, that's my objection to the phrase space launch system, because a rocket ain't a system, friends. But And it may seem like a strange diversion for me to say so, but this is why. Even though I'm uplifted by the achievements of, for example, SpaceX and Blue Origin and the various other private enterprise space activities that are going on right now, I'm uplifted by those achievements. I'm heartened by them because, of course, the key was you could never go to NASA and buy a Saturn V launch. You could never really go to NASA and buy a space shuttle launch, although in the early days of shuttle, they talked about that as being their goal. You can go to SpaceX and buy a Falcon Heavy launch. And if you want to know all about my proposal for putting people on the moon permanently with Falcon Heavy, not even having to worry about whether the Starship thing works or not, I'm willing to tell you about it at length later. Contact me separately. I'm not going to take up more of Joe's time with that. But at the same time that I'm uplifted, I'm also filled with unease. Why? Simply because people are getting the idea that space, which in the 1960s was an arena for confrontation between the superpowers, they're now getting the idea that it's an arena for confrontation between the super wealthy, between men like Musk and Bezos. And if anything is fatal to a social movement, it's the idea that this is some kind of gladiatorial duel between people we don't care about. And again, this shows how dangerous it is to depend on anyone other than us, right? The social movement, the people who feel the deep-seated urge to get off of this rock, the people who understand that if there is a future for humanity, it is in the vast magnificence of the cosmos, not glued to the thin, habitable, comfortable surface layer of this one ball of rock. And so the one thing that I hope for and pray for and insist upon, and that I have to ask all of you to make your utmost goal, is that message that bookended the Apollo missions. What did Neil say? What did Gene say? In peace for all mankind. Don't leave anybody out. Don't leave the Indians out just because they've never put a man into space on their own launch system. Don't leave South Africa out because they don't have satellites. Don't leave Bolivia out because you can't even remember where it is on a map. In peace for all mankind, because Carol Redfield said it just right. Once you get that far away, you can't see, Bolivia or South Africa, right? You see the Earth, and it's where we came from. It's where we're from. And friends, the one message that I always wish to convey to people is, in my belief, home isn't where you come from, it's where you're going. Our home is the cosmos.
Thank you very much. That was an absolutely great summation, Chris, of, I'll say it, one point of view, but a really original and unique one in so many ways. I've watched your documentary, Lunacy, by the way. It was delightful. I enjoyed it. Next, Janet Ivey. Janet is the Chief Excitement Officer and creator of Janet's Planet, the president of Explore Mars, and on the board of governors for the National Space Society. Janet?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Janet Ivey, and I was planning on being in person with you this AM, but I just found out that any moment from now, the grandkids are coming by. My daughter-in-law has a work emergency, so a Jan to the rescue. I just want to celebrate this moment, this month, this year, and the future with all of you. 50 years ago, the last humans were on the moon. A day from now, with Orion's successful return, the students of today, and I just was with 200 of them yesterday, 200 fifth graders, and we were making our command modules with parachutes and everything, preparing for the successful return of Orion. And I know that Anita will say something similar, but once kids are exposed, have an experience with space, know the possibilities that even exist, most still don't even know the vast, amazing possibilities within the space industry. They get excited and they are ready once you prime that pump. And I see it from governments around the country to commercial partners, to global partners, to private sector, to even Ghana. A few weeks ago, I got an email or a LinkedIn message, and they were asking, could I speak to a couple of students in Ghana because they wanted to be the first astronauts from Ghana. This is such a pivotal and powerful moment in time and history, and to be a small part of inspiring the next generation of explorers who will carry out all of our space dreams is just an honor and a privilege. So let's remember this, that as we celebrate this amazing season of hope, that the students of today, the ones that we should definitely stand up and mentor and encourage and do all that we can, they will be standing on the shoulders of giants as they embark on their space journey. And it's going to be nothing less than spectacularly stellar. I'm wishing Orion a very safe and successful splashdown, and wishing all of you that your space be merry and bright. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Janet. Next, Anita Gale. Anita is the current Chief Executive Officer for the National Space Society. She's a retired Boeing engineer with 40 years experience as a project engineer and systems engineer on the Space Shuttle and commercial crew programs. Here's Anita's tape.
Hello, and please accept my apologies that this message is recorded instead of being presented in person. I do apologize for that. I was a senior in college. I was majoring in aeronautics and astronautics, College of Engineering, University of Washington, go Huskies, Alamo Bowl this year, aiming for a career in the space industry. We knew when the Apollo 17 LEM left the moon, we knew that people would be going back there sooner rather than later. We knew this. Most of my engineering career was in cargo integration on the space shuttle program, which actually was just starting serious design in the same year, 1972, 50 years ago. And we knew on the space shuttle and payload and cargo integration that we could launch spacecraft that would go to the moon. But our NASA customers never asked us to do that. So here we are 50 years later with no new blueprints on the moon. 100 years from now, historians will look back at us and ask, what was wrong with those people that they missed this opportunity for half a century? Finally, though, we are fixing this. And even as the Artemis mission is returning from the moon, we're going back. And maybe we needed to wait this long to get it right. Because now, instead of flags and footprints, we're now planning infrastructure and industry, which is really how it needs to go. The good news for NSS members is National Space Society is right in the middle of it, helping to make it happen. This future that will involve commercial space and settling in space and using lunar resources. So NSS has people who are visiting congressional offices, affecting legislation that will enable things like property rights on the moon. It's kind of hard to start a business if you build a factory and somebody comes and takes it over. President Michelle Hanlon is a space lawyer who helped write the Artemis Accords, establishing how we'll work with other nations on the moon. NSS conferences bring together people who will be part of those future lunar industries. NSS is looking toward the future and who will be in business years from now. We have programs that inspire students to prepare for space industry careers. I happen to run one of them called the Space Settlement Design Competition, which we started in 1984. And we know there are engineers in the industry now because of what we do. NSS is also working with other organizations that are aiming for the same goals in different ways, including Expanding Frontiers in Brownsville, Texas, which is incubating engineers to work in the space business. To me, I see the moon as the key to everything that National Space Society wants to do to settle and do business in space, that wants humanity to settle and do business in space. If anyone tells you that we've been there, done that, and the moon is just a barren blob of mostly volcanic rock, remind them of a mine in Sudbury, Canada, which has been producing high-grade ores since the 1880s. And we know now it's an asteroid impact site. Think about the far side of the moon, the lunar highlands. We don't have flags and footprints there. It's primordial lunar highlands. It's not these lava basalt mare. It's primordial lunar highlands that have been pummeled by everything the universe can throw at it for billions of years. And how many Sudbury mines are back? How many resources, what kinds of resources are back there on the far side of the moon? And it's impact chemistry in extreme thermal and radiation environments, in vacuum. We don't even know how to analyze what compounds and isotopes might have happened in impact chemistry in those primordial highlands, bedrock of the lunar far side. So here we are, 50 years after Apollo 17. We're just starting with the Artemis mission right now. We're talking about Gateway. We're talking about a spaceport in lunar orbit. And these are the keys that will start us towards industrializing the moon, having commercial businesses on the moon, and seeing the promise that we thought would happen 40 years ago. But it's happening now. Thank you. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thanks, Anita. Next, Rod Pyle. Rod wears many hats. For NSS, he's editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine. He's an author, a member of several boards, and the host of This Week in Space on the This Week in Tech, or TWIT, or TWIT network. Here's Rod's tape.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having us with you today. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine, and I'm here with Tarek Malik, who's the editor-in-chief at space.com, which should be one of your favorite destinations. And together, we host the This Week in Space podcast for the TWIT TV network. It's also available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else. I want to apologize first up for my informality today. I'm down here working on my boat in San Diego, so it's a little scruffy, and Tarek is working at home because he can. So Tarek, as a person who is too delightfully young to have been around for Apollo 17 in person, what are your impressions of it in hindsight? What made it important?
Well, you know, I kind of came of age in the space shuttle era, so I missed all of the great, amazing, just the excitement of what Apollo was at the time. I mean, it was still amazing, right? Growing up as a kid of the space age, and knowing that this was a thing that humanity did, right? That we went to the moon. But to me, Apollo 17, as I was growing up, is the mission where we stopped going to the moon. That's what it meant. That was the end, and maybe we'll go back, but we were never going to go back again. And of course, I always knew that was the first one that carried a scientist, Harrison Schmitt, the first actual scientist to walk on the moon and do actual science as opposed to astronauts. And so that kind of really solidified what that mission meant. But to me, it was a mission of finality. It was the last one. There weren't going to ever be any more. Maybe we'll go back sometime, but it will be very different. And that's kind of what it went to me. And, I always knew that Eugene Cernan, and I had the pleasure of meeting, I'm sure you have too, those closing words on the moon where he said, we leave as we came, and God willing, we shall return with peace and hope for all mankind. And I thought, well, that would be nice if we go back. But then, we forget about it. We had the shuttle. We stayed in low Earth orbit for decades, and we're still there now.
We might be, but our spacecraft has gone beyond.
That's right.
You have Artemis out there, doing its thing. I feel so fortunate in a way, not because I'm elderly, but because I was around to see these incredible missions of exploration take off, sometimes as close as every 2 months, which in today's world is unfathomable, right? Same impression as you, Apollo 17 was kind of the end of the line. We were vaguely aware as young people that there had been plans for Apollos 18, 19, and 20. And what I found so horrifying about 17 being the last flight, it was a spectacular flight, longest number of orbits, 75, longest duration, longest EVAs, 3 EVAs, big achievement, scientist and all that. But what I found so horrifying is not that they canceled the entirety of 18, 19, and 20, but that they built out the hardware, just canceled the flight operations, basically. And years later, I met Cernan very briefly, but I got to be pretty good friends with Joe Engle. And, it's a hard question to ask. Gee, how did you feel about getting yanked from the flight for a geologist? But it came up at one point, and being a gentleman from a classic mold, he was very gracious about it. And he said, I've had a long time to think about it. I'm paraphrasing, but I understand why they felt they needed to send a scientist. And Schmidt had originally been scheduled for 18,
Mhm.
and had been training for that regional geology, and then suddenly got put on 17 because it was the end of the line. So I think it was a good decision, and it gave us a lot of interesting return. I mean, what they were hoping to get from 17 was some very old lunar samples in the highlands and hopefully some evidence of volcanism, and what came back was kind of a mixed bag. There is the famous, look, there's orange soil episode, which was great to listen to. There's also, you know, for anyone who's actually sat through the tapes of the EVAs, that moment where they had to fix the fender on the rover because it was spraying dust all over everybody. But just a spectacular mission. And, you know, Cernan had a reputation as being a bit of a off-the-cuff operator prior to at least the Apollo missions, if not this one. But I have to say, you know, listening to those guys work together, you know, he sounded like a trained field geologist on the moon. And of course, then we had Ron Evans in orbit, who's kind of the quiet third astronaut. But
yeah, Ron Evans, a trans-Earth spacewalk, right? The
Yeah.
hour, 6 minutes out there to get film that now astronauts don't even have to go outside to pick up anymore from cameras. So they can just switch views with the press of a button now. So a lot of things have changed. You know, when astronauts do go back on Orion, I guess now in 2024, if you know Artemis 1 you know ends its mission successfully, they'll have a very different, I think, experience. I mean, not the least of which is that, you know, we don't have a spindly, spidery lunar module that is going to return astronauts to the moon. It's going to be this giant starship that SpaceX has built.
It's like landing a semi-truck on its back bumper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a really big difference. I will say that there was a really interesting kind of return. It wasn't actually moon-based, but that Apollo 17 did give us, and that was this blue marble photo of the Earth from a distance, a full Earth from out in deep space. That view is really important. A reminder that we are all in one place in our solar system, and that we do have to take care of it over time.
Well said, younger man. We got to go and make room for others. So I appreciate you for joining me, and just want to remind everybody once again, This Week in Space podcast with Rod Pyle and Tariq Malik, the ineffable Tariq Malik. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. And thank you all.
Thanks, Rod. Next, Fred Becker. Fred, aka Mr. Downlink, is one of those important cogs that keeps the NSS wheels turning. Fred has been indispensable in many, many ways. Fred's going to take us back in time, back when Fred was a high school student, literally. At the time, very few people had movie cameras. So movie has been made by Fred, but it's a movie of still pictures, because that's what he, a high school student, had when he watched Apollo 16 launch. He's got a recording of the radio announcer announcing the launch. He's recording a radio that's sitting beside him, and it's an old radio from 50 years ago. So you're going to watch a little bit of the past. Okay, Fred, you're on.
Fire in the bird. Look at her, she is burning up. Here's that flame to each side. And she's holding. There she goes. She's lifting up right now. Satisfied. Look at the tilt over. There she is, tipping on the planet first. Beautifully right now. The flames are just over. She's past the power right now. And she's going beautifully. Listen to her come back. They've got at least 500 feet of flame right now. Beautiful bird. Going beautifully. Climbing up. She's rolling now. It's not fast. You may not hear it now. That's that thing that's on. Like a stem fire right aside in time. Some dripping up the side of that rocket. He's really hammering away. Going to the thing. Going to the thing that is put out now. Here's the rest of it. A perfect crash this time. Now she's leading them very clearly into the plane. Here comes the Vertical right now. But they'll be matched to maximum dynamic air pressure. A beautiful tour all by herself in the sky. The flame is spinning power and power back. The rest of the flame is going to spit out right now. The deep powers will change color. And we see a big X-bill, a big crash we talked about right now. She's on a match too. Watch the flames spread. Wider and wider. And there is the crash in the sky when we talked about the fiery crash. Our arrow here that top is up. Very beautifully. Astronaut Part of the paper tonight, so a plane is quickest starting up here right now. At 2 minutes 40 seconds, we should get that. Look at that flame spread by itself. We've got the flame burning up to each side. 35 seconds to go before full cutoff. We should get a go on the first day. The centimeter should cut out at about 80 seconds right now. And there's the flame, the plasma trail we talked about before. A giant cross in the sky. Okay, that first engine is just about off. Inboard and taking a watch for that thing to go. Centimeter cut off on time. 4 more to go, 2 minutes and 30 seconds. 12 seconds to go. 26 nautical miles. Now watch it and keep looking for that staging in the 8 meter rock as far as she shuts down. 5 seconds to go. Coming up any moment now. And there she is. There she stays right there. Ignition of stage 2. Clear the door. Stage 2 burning, separated, and there she goes. And after that, we put a perfect staging on stage 2. We can see that now that yellow flame is gone, what you're going to see is a clear flame from the burning of the liquid helium and liquid hydrogen. There's that single brilliant big type of light like the old Gemini days. We have got a beautiful light. I can watch that first stage forward here. We call it out mission to 2. The day's work reported. And she is going just beautifully. And still watching it. The escape jettison from the stage 2 should take place right now. And a few seconds later, the escape power should fire. Still got it in there. Still got it in there. There we go. We got separation of the escape. That's enough talking. Very calming, very calming. Still got it in sight.
There it was. There she goes.
Thanks, Fred. Next, Gerald Nordley. Gerald is, above all, a prolific writer of published material, both hard science and science fiction. Besides writing, he has done consulting work in astronautical engineering on tethers, on advanced propulsion, and on world building for other science fiction authors. Gerald?
My Air Force astronautical engineering career and the Apollo lunar program overlapped for exactly 1 month in December of 1972. I was, for that month, a part of a rather interesting contingency plan. During the Cold War, the United States Air Force monitored nuclear testing with a network of ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma-ray sensing source locating spacecraft known as Vela Hotel, orbiting about 1/3 of the way to the moon. This highly classified operation would also detect gamma-ray bursts from deep space and the sun. Solar gamma-ray bursts were often the precursors of coronal mass ejections, streams of high-energy protons, which could be deadly outside the protection of the Earth's magnetic field. Gamma rays reach Earth in 8 minutes, while the dangerous peak of proton radiation comes along about 2 or 3 days later. It would thus be possible to get astronauts off the moon and back within the Earth's protective magnetic field before the worst of the solar storm arrived at the Earth-Moon system. Even cutting the exposure in half would help. During the Apollo mission windows, Vela data were continuously monitored by the Air Force Satellite Control Facility at Sunnyvale Air Force Station. At the SCF, the Vela Hotel Satellite Operations was commanded by Field Task Force Director Major Wynoma Clare, one of the first female field grade officers in the Air Force. If the Vela satellite data contained a significant event, the data could be scrubbed and put on emission-free punch paper tape. We were very careful about security back then, and it was sent to the Inter-Range Operations Office of the Network Operations Division, where I was a very new addition. I was just 25 years old at the time. The punch paper tape was then hand-carried to the Network Operations Comm Center, where it would be transmitted to the Goddard Space Flight Center through a discus satellite. Once the data got to the Solar Weather Laboratory at Goddard, the experts would evaluate it and make a recommendation to the Manned Flight Center at Houston, Texas. At Houston, coordinating with Goddard and the astronauts on the moon, a decision might be made to recall the astronauts. Fortunately, this didn't happen early. All I had to do was practice and spend a couple nights in the office. And the astronauts, of course, came back on the nominal timeline. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Gerald. That was really interesting. Next, Lisa Westwood. Lisa is a registered professional archaeologist. She is the co-founder of the Apollo 11 Preservation Task Force. With Beth Laura O'Leary and M. Wayne Donaldson, she led the effort to list the objects associated with the Tranquility Base on the California Register of Historical Resources and the New Mexico State Register of Cultural Properties. Here's her tape.
Space archaeologists and historians often celebrate the first time a milestone was achieved. Some of the most memorable events in human history and human spaceflight are associated with the Wright brothers, Yuri Gagarin, John Glenn, Apollo 11. These firsts are often memorialized because they represent important events in human history. As space archaeologists, my colleagues and I successfully achieved designation of the artifacts and structures at Apollo 11's Tranquility Base on the Moon on the California and New Mexico historical registers. In doing so, it was another important first. It was the first time that any historic site not physically located on Earth became listed on a historical registry. But equally important to the firsts, but perhaps more solemn, are the lasts. Apollo 17 marks the end of an era. The evolution of technology during the Apollo program is reflected in changes like transporting and operating vehicles on the moon. Apollo 17 was important in its own right. Harrison Schmitt was the first scientist to land on the moon, a geologist. Here we are today in 2022, and it will be 50 years since humans stepped foot on the moon during the Apollo 17 mission. Thinking about how much we've learned about the moon from the Apollo program, yet how much we still have yet to understand and how much technology has improved since Apollo 17 makes me excited for what's to come. Using the Apollo missions as a springboard, NASA is now finally headed back to the moon again, and we are in reach of another historic first. The Artemis mission will send the first woman and first person of color to the moon. This sends an important message about inclusivity to those who historically have been underrepresented in lunar exploration. What we learn from Artemis, we will apply towards achieving the first human presence on Mars. Who knows what lies ahead for our descendants? One thing's for sure, we have many more firsts and lasts to come. As we celebrate the anniversary of Apollo 17, let's not forget its contributions to space heritage and the importance of saving the same. What's left of the material culture of the history of human space exploration is delicate and fragmented and worthy of preservation. Instead of retracing steps decades later to locate, document, and reconstruct historically important artifacts, structures, and documents, we need to change our perspective. We need to be looking ahead in order to preserve the important materials of the past. All of us are very lucky to be alive at a time when space history is in the making. Recognizing and celebrating these watershed events and milestones as they are happening helps to preserve them and carry on their full legacy. So, to Apollo 17 and to the important contributions of the Breakfast on the Moon program to historic preservation, I raise a glass. Ad Astra.
Thanks, Lisa. And last but far from least, Dr. Beth O'Leary. Beth is Professor Emeritus with the New Mexico State University Department of Anthropology and is a pioneer in the field of space archaeology and heritage. She's working currently with the Aerospace Heritage Task Force for the International Council on Monuments and Sites to preserve historical archaeological sites on the moon. Here's Beth's tape.
Only 3 years ago, this past July, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first landing on the moon by the Apollo 11 crew. Today, we are gathered to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the last landing on the lunar surface by the Apollo 17 astronauts. How time flies. 1/2 a century seems to be the right amount of time to celebrate big events, a big birthday, a golden wedding anniversary, when people have a huge party and reflect on what has happened. It applies to both personal and national historic events. After 50 years, according to the US historic preservation law, a place becomes historic and is easier to get nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. As a space archaeologist with archaeological colleagues, I have advocated for our states and our nation to recognize and find ways to preserve the amazing legacy of the Apollo program. In 2010, our Apollo Space Heritage Task Force successfully nominated the first lunar landing site at Tranquility Base to the historic registers of both California and New Mexico. We have come to the end of an era. The Apollo program ended with those last steps on the moon on December 14th, 1972, when Apollo 17 commander Eugene Cernan climbed back into the LEM for the final time. He remarked, "I am on the surface, and as I take man's last steps from the surface, I'd like to just say what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return with peace and hope for mankind." Apollo 17 astronaut Eugene Cernan passed away in 2017. We have only 4 of the original group of 12 humans who walked on the moon. Apollo 17 LEM pilot Harrison Schmitt is still with us. As a fellow New Mexican and scientist, I feel a close kinship with him. Born in Santa Rita, New Mexico in 1935, he was one of the first group of scientist astronauts. With a PhD in geology, he learned and taught other astronauts about lunar geology. He collected samples at Taurus Littrow. One sample of troctolite is a central piece of evidence that the moon once possessed an active magnetic field. I am sure as a geologist, he wanted to stay longer on the lunar surface to collect and study the topography, rocks, and regoliths. The work done by Schmitt makes the lunar landing there extra extraordinary. These astronauts created the last archaeological site where humans walked on the moon. Or, as Neil Armstrong once remarked, yeah, we left a few things up there. The rover, tracks, and artifacts left there in 1972 are still there. The site deserves to be protected from adverse effects. It has been singled out as exceptionally important in the 2011 NASA guidelines to protect the historic and scientific values of American lunar artifacts. We are in a new space age. As Harrison Schmitt was the first astronaut geologist, there is now an opportunity to put the first astronaut archaeologist on the moon. It is clearly a challenge to protect the past here on Earth, but we must find ways to preserve places like Tranquility Base and Taurus Littrow, where humans have been present for the first, and as of today, the last time in human history. I'm happy to celebrate this day with you. But as we do, let us reflect on all that humanity has done on the moon. We have unconscionably lost and continue to lose many extraordinary sites on our own little blue dot. We cannot and should not lose Earth's heritage on the moon.
Thanks, Beth. And that concludes this final installment of Breakfast on the Moon. Thanks to all who took part over the last 3.5 years. With this, the last breakfast, we now temporarily close the book on the era of the Apollo moon landings and pass the torch forward to some future time when it will once again be celebrated and honored.